Webster Jr. here, Pursuit of Happiness Radio. Thanks for tuning in. It's been an interesting week for the Libertarian Party. I've always said I'm a libertarian. I'm an outspoken libertarian. To quote my friend Corey Stevens from Rare.us, I feel like a conservative when I'm around libertarians, and I feel like a libertarian when I'm around conservatives. And, you know, this week, Gary Johnson, one of the leaders of the Libertarian Party, a guy I'm going to vote for. You know, they say don't vote for the lesser of two evils. I feel like I'm voting for the lesser of three evils with Gary Johnson. But let's face it, he's not perfect, but well, he's a lot better than Trump or Hillary. This week, Gary Johnson came out with a carbon tax idea. He supports the idea that there is such a thing as man-made climate change, and I'm not necessarily suggesting that there is or isn't. I'm not trying to prove that in this segment. I think our radio listeners know how I feel about that, but it is a surprise for a fiscal conservative, a free market conservative, to come out with that as a policy. It's not what you expect. I wanted to talk to somebody about the Libertarian Party, and this is not an interview about Gary Johnson. I'm just throwing that out there because it's in the news today. The guy on the phone right now is somebody I am throwing my support to. He's a politician and a doctor and a freedom advocate from Texas. His name's Mark Miller, Dr. Mark Miller. He's running for Texas Railroad Commissioner, which, as people in Texas know, the railroad commissioner position's changed quite a bit over years. It now has quite a bit to do with oil and gas. Mr. Mark Miller, Dr. Mark Miller, thank you for doing the show today.
You bet. Thank you, Ken. Glad to be here.
What is your, what kind of doctor are you? What's your expertise?
I'm a PhD petroleum engineer. I've got a PhD from Stanford, taught petroleum engineering for a time, for about 18 years at the University of Texas at Austin. So I have a lot of experience in oil and gas going all the way back to 1972.
Nice. Stanford. I've never heard of that. Is that a good school?
Yeah, it is a good school. At least it used to be when I was there. I don't know now.
Yeah, well, liberalism has had its effect, but I think that Stanford is still a pretty good college. I mean, if you go to Stanford, you're fine. Mark, what do you think?
There's some conservatives there. You know, they have that Hoover Institute at Stanford. And Condoleezza Rice came out of Stanford, of course. She was provost there.
You know, as we do make fun of the Ivy League colleges quite a bit on conservative talk radio, but the conservative Republicans of Harvard, a very smart group of intellectual conservatives, I'm sure the Stanford Republicans are the same way. You know, the intellectual Republicans, I think we need their support right now more than ever, considering who their candidate is. And I think they know that. Over here on the Libertarian Party. Well, I opened up the segment with a little information about Gary Johnson and something he's advocating for. Do you have an opinion about that, Mark? I hate to put you on the spot. I know that's not why you're here.
Well, actually, I do. I've written extensively about climate change, and in fact, just on my blog last week, I had a 5-part series on climate change, expressing what I believe was my point of view, and what I thought was a somewhat libertarian point of view as well. I point out that it's not. Although, you know, the way we tend to talk about it in the news is either a believer or a non-believer, right? Those are the two choices.
Sure.
And the reality is it's a complex set of questions. And I laid out a series of 5 questions that really ought to be asked about climate change. And sort of went through them one at a time and laid out my positions on them.
Well, one of my heroes is John Stossel. And John Stossel said, you know, I'm sure you know who that is. He's a brilliant man. And he said that there is some proof of man-made climate change. There is some proof, but there's no proof of eminent domain. Of eminent danger happening. There's no proof that the world's about to end, or that we're going to die, or even that our children will die. The next couple generations, let's face it. I mean, this might affect us in 700 years, but the sky is not falling right now. But at any given point during history, there's always been somebody that says that the sky is falling, and that's sort of what we're getting here. So what's your take on what Johnson's doing? Is he pandering? Do you think that his heart's in the right place?
I really have not seen his exact statement. I've seen some people suggest there was some picking and choosing going on. I really don't know, so I probably shouldn't speak to Gary Johnson's position. But my belief, if you to drop back to that for just a second, is that what you said earlier was very important, because the impending doom is based on computer models, and it's not based on scientific fact. And people confuse the two. They're forecasts, like forecasting the economy or the weather. You know, it's a difficult thing to do. But even if you take the forecast as true, there's actually considerable evidence that it might cost about the same money to adjust to climate change as it would be to prevent it. And if we try to prevent it, we're going to make the world a lot poorer.
Sure.
And if we adjust to it, it'll be a richer world that will be adjusting to it, not a poorer one. So I think there's some good arguments for, even if you believe there is some human component, that no, we shouldn't be investing a lot of money, certainly by the government.
Yeah, certainly not by the government. And that's not to say that taking care of pollution isn't an issue. We want things to be clean. We want people to be responsible, especially businesses, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So what is the libertarian solution to that, Mark?
To climate change?
Well, what is the libertarian solution to getting big business and corporations to respect the earth to some extent?
Well, the key in my view is to make sure that what government does is not have as its goal protecting the earth, but having a goal of protecting people. In other words, if somebody's polluting the air that I'm breathing, I consider that a personal trespass. And so I think there's a legitimate role if somebody is ruining my air or ruining the water that I share with the rest of the folks that live on this earth, that there is a role of preventing that or at least cleaning it up. And you don't have to be telling companies exactly what to do. All you have to do is say, look, you can't do that. You can't pollute the river. You can't pollute the air because people are going to sue you. And so there needs to be recourse. To me, the recourse means you have to empower people. You have to empower individuals. They have to have a way to go after the polluters. And right now we have a legal system that can't happen.
Right.
I mean, try going to court against ExxonMobil. You think you're going to win?
Right.
Probably not.
Well, you're onto something there. People don't seem to understand what the EPA really does. You hear the name Environmental Protection Agency and you think, oh, protect the environment. That sounds good, an agency that does that. Well, that's not really the case. Back before the EPA existed, if somebody was polluting on your land, let's say you're a farmer or somebody that owns a big field or something, and there's a business polluting on it, well, you could build a case with evidence and hire a lawyer and sue them, and chances are you'd probably win if you had enough evidence. Then comes along the EPA, and the EPA has this thing that's essentially a polluter's permit. The polluter's permit gives them the right to pollute, and that takes away the ability for the farmer or the small landowner to sue the business. It's not, the EPA doesn't do what it's supposed to do. Am I wrong about this, Mark?
No, I think you're exactly right, and that's one of the biggest problems with regulations is it's the big guys that win when the regulations are put in, because all they have to do is follow the rules, and they say, hey, we're clean.
Right.
We did what the EPA said, and that should never be the case. Pollution is pollution, whether the EPA said it was okay or not.
Right. Right, I tend to agree with that. And the funny thing about it is these regulations are being written by the very lawyers who work for the corporations that they're intended to regulate. Is that pretty accurate too?
Well, I call this the battle of the giants. In other words, we have giant corporations and we have giant government, which we think are fighting each other, but in reality, they're working together. And the individual, the small company, those are the ones that tend to lose in that battle. And so we've got a system
Tell you what, Mark, I'm sorry to cut you off. Pause right there. Can you do one more segment with us?
Sure.
I'm just getting warmed up with Mark Miller. He's a libertarian candidate for Texas Railroad Commissioner. Don't change the channel. Fox News alert coming up at the top of the hour here, and I'm going to do another segment with Mark Miller. Don't change the channel.
The only difference between a prostitute and a politician is their salary and about 5 minutes of fun. Back to the sweet release of more Pursuit of Happiness Radio.
Oh, yeah.
And now, the Boyer.
Hey, Ken Webster Jr. here, Houston, Texas, Southeast Texas, and people listening anywhere on Earth with the iHeartRadio app. You know, if you're just tuning in and you're listening on terrestrial radio, I always like to remind radio listeners, you can listen to this radio show 24 hours a day with the iHeartRadio app. Just take your smartphone out of your pocket and do a search for Pursuit of Happiness Radio. You see that little fist there holding a microphone in front of the red and black flag? That's us. That's this show, Pursuit of Happiness Radio. It can also be heard on iHeartRadio.com, or just go to KPRCRadio.com, click podcast, click on Producer Kenny. That's me. Always happy to entertain you folks. On the line line right now, Mr. Dr. Mark Miller. Dr. Mark Miller has a PhD in studying petroleum science, essentially, oil and gas. He went to Stanford, spent a little time at University of Texas up in Austin there. Obviously a bright guy, and probably would be a great guy to have running the commissioner of railroad for Texas. As a lot of listeners in Texas might know, the commissioner of the railroad here in Texas plays a big role in oil and gas, and it hasn't always been that way. Mark, can you explain a little bit about why that is?
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. In fact, the Railroad Commission does no railroads at all any longer. It was originally established 125 years ago. It's one of the first regulatory agencies in the whole United States, and it was set up to regulate railroads. Texas was concerned about giving monopoly powers to railroads and them overcharging farmers and ranchers. And over the years, it was very gradually given responsibility over oil and gas, big time starting in the 1930s with the discovery of the East Texas field, and that changed everything. During the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, the Railroad Commission actually set the price of oil much the same way that OPEC does today, or OPEC tries to anyway. They did it by restricting production of Texas crude oil to meet, quote, market demand, effectively supporting prices. And so over the years, what happened was its authority over railroads gradually disappeared, was transferred either to the federal government or to the Department of Transportation. And the only things that are responsible for today are regulating oil and gas, regulating surface mining, and regulating pipelines within the state. Those are what the Railroad Commission does today. And interestingly enough, the legislature doesn't want to change the name, though. And I sure wish I could convince people to get on their legislature to make them do it.
Yeah, because there's really not that many railroads around. I mean, you got Amtrak, you got some industrial stuff. There used to be a train that went from Houston to Galveston, and I guess they got rid of it because it wasn't popular. The truth about Texans is we enjoy getting in our car and just driving 2 hours at the blink of an eye to go see a baseball game. I mean, hey, there's something going on over in Beaumont today, and we're in Austin. Let's jump in the car and drive over there. What other state in America is like that?
Well, a lot of the western states, of course, are like that. I don't know whether you know that big, what are they calling it, the Trans-Texas Corridor?